What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more early live Depeche Mode. Once again, major shout out to champion and friend of the channel, Han Solo, made available just, an absurd amount of music, including of Depeche Mode. And obviously, as a fan of their very early stuff, in particular when Vince is there, but I think also fair to say, some of the stuff in the remainder of the 80s, and perhaps just a little sliver of stuff in the 90s. But yeah, he's made available a bunch of stuff from their very early period. Now, I don't know, as we go to listen to this one, if this is pre-encounter with Daniel Miller and Mute, but if it is, I would say maybe I'm inclined to think that it's going to have a bit of an edgier, a bit of a harder sound, which a couple of the tunes we've listened to that came before they signed with Mute, including an early version of Photographic, had a bit more of an edge. They felt like a bit more deliberately outside the lines rather than a bit more, let's say, polished and sort of refined, like some of the tunes, including a later version of Photographic, did on Speak and Spell. So yeah, if this is from pre-Mute Depeche Mode, I would think it might have an edge to it. It might be a bit harder, a bit more sort of dirty on the lower end especially. But yeah, the tune is called Reason Man. Reason is a faculty, one most closely associated with logic and sort of critical thinking. But ultimately, reason is a term that is often used in, if not overtly ironic, at the very least questionable or dubious ways. Often a good example of that is the idea of common sense, which purports to be reasonable and logical, but in many cases what people suggest to be common sense is anything but. So if there are lyrics, perhaps it would relate to something like that, where someone is speaking in a way that they're insisting upon the way they see the world and it being very clear and right, but ultimately there might be a sort of, dark underbelly or an irony to that. So if there are lyrics, that's what I would think. I wouldn't be surprised if it's, a phrase that just works into a sort of catchy chorus. I know, and a lot of the early songs, and I'm thinking especially of, what's the name of it, the Hey You're Such a Pretty Boy. A number of people are like, not really sure what to make of that. It could be this, it could be that. So even if there are lyrics, I'm not sure if I'll be able to get a sense for it. But let's listen. This is Reason Man live by, I think, a very early Depeche Mode. Oh. Oh, wow. You're welcome. Thank you. I think we have to be like pre-Mute here. Obviously, it's a live bootleg recording, but no more reason. Music is logic, or reason is motive. I'm scared to I feel like the bass is a little hot, but we'll deal with it. Hear you laughing, Reason Man? Or I hear you laughing? I like the synth work. Relatively simple, but very atmospheric. And that buzzing pulse. sounded different that iteration. It was like, now you're shrinking, Reason Man, something like that. Yes. Sounds like a pretty small venue, fair to say, which, again, I know a lot of these groups not only sort of, cut their teeth and earn their chops, performing in like smaller venues, and then eventually went to larger ones. I'm now actually thinking that Han Solo, that I think one of his issues is that a group which kind of had that flavor in that sort of context, on that scale, and sort of, playing local clubs and so on, the idea that they became this huge, like, stadium, like, arena performance kind of group, that, only performs to 60,000 people or whatever. I think some of his beef, if you will, with their evolution over time is in relation to that transition. I can respect that. But yeah, like I said, that issue notwithstanding, it is another tune which I think very much speaks to that very early flavor they had, which had a bit of an edge, a bit of a grit and grime to it. So especially on the low end, that's like the second or third one where, like, the most of what I notice in terms of them having a different flavor than I associate with like early 80s Depeche Mode, it's on the lower part of the tune. It's the bass line, it's the sort of heavy, like grinding bass synth. So yeah, I enjoy that flavor. And again, it's an interesting thing to think about, that, if they had sort of, maybe not followed Daniel Miller's sort of roadmap as much, if they maybe had retained a bit more of that grit, would they have gotten to an album like Ultra, or at least an album that did some of the sort of dirtier experimental sort of sounds that Ultra did earlier? Maybe not exactly. Again, by the time you get to the 90s, I know they've introduced more rock elements, and I think, again, that's another thing that a friend of the channel, Han Solo, has criticized, that they sort of moved away from what had been their bread and butter. But either way, it is a tune that makes me think about their evolution over time, both like in the short term in the early 80s and as you go along, especially, as I said, in relation to the context of how many people were clapping and cheering at the end, which sounded like a few score, maybe, like 40, 60, 80 people. But yeah, really cool. Once again, shout out to Han Solo for sharing this material. It's exciting to like listen to music that is essentially from the era when their music became this, huge influence on my life, but they're tunes that I've never heard before, and which, were not released in the same capacity as the more familiar early and mid 80s Depeche Mode tracks. Whatever, I'll stop talking. Do let me know what you think of this live performance. Do let me know what you think of, sort of the early Depeche Mode sound as I'm coming to understand it, and perhaps you are as well. And other than that, I will see you next time. Peace.